Cancer is a nefarious little monster. It lurks in the dark recesses of your body, hiding in the shadows as it festers and grows. Unlike other diseases, it doesn't just come right at you. No, it's a manipulator, a clever evil thing that corrupts your own cells to work against you. Worst of all, it lingers. It lingers. You go through the most painful of supposed treatments in hopes of exorcising it from you. In many ways, the cure is just as awful as the affliction. Sometimes it looks like the treatment is working. The monster recedes back into the darkness as the radiation kills off its corrupted minions. Finally, as the poison being pumped into your veins reaches into its hiding spot, the monster itself is purged. For days, months, years even, you believe that you've come out on the other side without your unwanted passenger. For the first time in a long time, you feel hope, and with that hope comes happiness. You're grateful for every moment now because you've come out of the other side of a disease that has claimed so many others. Except you haven't. The monster is not only clever, but it's also strong. It can't be removed by something as feeble as human science. No, it only retreated because it wants you to feel joy, so that it can once again snatch it away from you. Cancer is sadistic. I'm proof of that. For over 10 years, I thought I was free of it. It waited a decade to resurface, and now it's come back to finish the job. It's through playing with me. The game is over. Next month is my 99th birthday, and I'm going to either be celebrating it in this hospital bed or in my grave. Try as I might, I can't decide which option is the better one. Still, I can't say that I haven't lived a long and full life. It's a life that's been more than I deserved. What I do deserve is the way that it's ending. It's fitting that the monster of cancer is tearing me apart after what I did back in 1948. I helped bring one monster into this world, and now another is taking me out of it. There's a kind of cosmic balance to it all. I think about that night every single day. It remains burned into my mind like a brand. I've kept the memory to myself out of equal parts shame and some flimsy belief that not telling the story makes it not real. Here at the end, though, I know that I can't go to whatever waits for me on the other side without confessing my most horrible sin. I was only 24 the night of Halloween in 1948. Still just a boy, really. Just like everyone at that age, I believed myself to be a man. You don't realize just how little you know until you have the benefit of hindsight, and by then, it's often too late to do anything about it. Back then, Lamplight Woods wasn't much of a town. The town is growing nowadays with that plastic company having come to town. This is way before that. Way before that, even way before the Ambrose Logging Company decades ago. What most people these days don't realize is that back in the first half of the 1900s, Lamplight Woods was kept small by design. A number of rich families from the East Coast decided that it would be nice to have a private place to go to relax, away from the scrutiny of everything from the press to the government. What better place for that than a secluded town in the middle of the woods in Ohio? Many of those families visited in October and November. That was the time of year that the leaves had changed into bursts of red, yellow, and orange, and unlike locations such as Upper New York, it wasn't swarming with tourists. Why be in close proximity to the underclass when you could take in the view with those of your own ilk? That was the type of mindset that most of those wealthy families had. Of course, just having a town to use as your private playground didn't mean anything if there wasn't a place to stay. That void was filled by Frederick Ambrose. Yes, Ambrose, the same family that ended up returning to Lamplight Woods years later and opening a logging company. He was one of the first to take an interest in the town and see its potential for his wants and needs. For both his own comfort and for the potential income from his peers, Ambrose built a large lodge deep in the woods the locals called Blackwood. He ended up using that name for his exclusive hotel, calling it the Blackwood Lodge. Sometimes I wonder if he knew why that part of Lamplight Woods was known to the people that lived here as Blackwood. As local legend has it, It was the place that some of the original settlers in the area made camp when they first arrived. On the third night there was some sort of disagreement between them, and by morning, half the group had been brutally murdered. The killings were so brutal that blood covered the nearby trees, staining the bark black as it dried, hence the name Blackwood. Whether he knew that story when he was building the lodge or not, a number of the teenage children of the family staying there during Halloween learned of it somehow. They were intrigued by the grisly details, as many young people are, and they decided that given the day, it was the perfect time to conduct a seance. No, I was born and raised right here in Lamplight Woods, and we local folks didn't socialize with the rich visitors much. I first heard about the seance while I was at work at the local general store. Craigley's Goods and Sundries was the only such store in Lamplight Woods, which isn't a surprise given how small the town was back then. Because of this, both the visiting wealthy families and the town residents were forced to frequent the store to pick up any groceries or supplies that they needed. This suited old man Craigley just fine, as he was able to gouge the pockets of the wealthy ones while still getting his recurring income from the residents. He started doing so well that he decided to hire an assistant. I'm the one who got that job. Craigley took Sundays off, so I was alone in the store when Greta Thorne walked in on that cold autumn day. I'll be the first to admit that I didn't like most of the people that stayed at Blackwood Lodge. I found them to be pretentious, and I've never had much use for people that spend their time looking down their noses instead of straight ahead. Greta was cut from a different cloth, however. She was always quick with a kind word, and she didn't flaunt her social and financial status. She was also quite beautiful, and I was quite smitten with her. I don't remember what it was that she came into the store for. She was likely searching for a new book to add to her always growing collection. She was a voracious reader, and Craigley always made it a point to have new books waiting for her when her family visited. He barely even upcharged her for them. That's how charming she was. We got to talking. She mentioned that she would be attending a seance at Blackwood Lodge that evening. She was an educated woman. She didn't believe in such things as spirits, but she thought that it would be entertaining all the same. That's when she did something so unexpected that I found myself at a loss for words. She invited me to attend as her guest. That simply didn't happen. Townsfolk and the wealthy visitors didn't socialize like that. I doubt that Greta understood what she was doing at the time. She was inviting me to visit a world that I could never be a part of. I didn't see it like that at the time, of course. All that I knew was that a lovely young woman that I was sweet on was asking me to spend time with her. What else could I say but yes? It wasn't until she left that the reality of the matter started sinking in. I had nothing in common with these people. How could I possibly hope to fit in? I didn't even have proper attire. Still, she really was quite beautiful, and I was a young man. Of course I was going to latch on to this singular opportunity. That's how I found myself standing in front of Blackwood Lodge at 8 o'clock sharp that evening, wearing my father's suit and wondering what had possessed me to accept the invitation. I was debating on whether to knock on the door or simply enter when it opened and solved the problem for me. Greta smiled at me through the opening and beckoned me to come inside. She was wearing a very formal black dress, and I immediately felt self-conscious about the old repaired suit that I was garbed in. She either didn't notice or she didn't care, however, as she took my hand and led me through the lodge lobby. I had never been in a place as fancy as Blackwood Lodge, and I haven't been in any place as fancy since. To my uninitiated eyes, it looked like a palace. Everything was made of expensive woods and brass, and large chandeliers with small crystals that reflected the light hung from the ceiling. I'm sure that my mouth was open as I gaped at the opulence I was surrounded by. Greta led me out of the lobby and into one of the many hallways. The thick rug was soft underfoot, and it muffled the sounds of our passage. We made a number of turns before coming to a door that led back outside. Our destination was a courtyard where a large round table and 8 chairs had been set up. 5 of the chairs were occupied by young men and women dressed as nicely as Greta. They watched us as we approached. There were a number of smiles and nods of approval from my hostess, but I noticed that most of the gazes weren't nearly so kind when they fell on me. The 6th person sitting at the table was an older woman in her 50s or 60s. Instead of the formal wear the other guests were sporting, She was instead wearing a white blouse with a black robe over it. Sitting on a wooden stand in front of her was a large crystal ball. She was exactly what you would think of when hearing the words fortune teller, and that immediately made me suspicious. It wouldn't have been the first time that a con artist took advantage of those that were both wealthy and gullible. "That's Madame Hawthorne," Greta whispered to me. "Supposedly she's able to communicate with the dead. She'll be leading the seance." We sat down next to each other in the two remaining chairs. As I pulled the chair in towards the table, I noticed the girl on the other side of me scoot hers away a few inches. I probably should have felt indignant, but instead, I just felt embarrassed. The supposed medium looked around the table for a moment before nodding once to herself. She proceeded to tell us that tonight, on this most spiritual of nights, she would guide us in communicating with the dead. After a dramatic pause, she continued, stating that the spirits of the deceased followed us all throughout our lives, and that she had been born with the gift to channel those spirits and to speak for them. A number of the people gathered around the table appeared to be entranced by what she was saying, but I had to stop myself from scowling and rolling my eyes. As she finished her clearly rehearsed speech, Madame Hawthorne instructed us to all hold hands. I glanced over at Greta as she slid her hand into mine, and I couldn't help but notice the slight blush on her cheeks as she did so. The reaction from the young woman next to me was quite different, as she seemed to be trying to make as little contact as possible with my skin. We all closed our eyes at Madame Hawthorne's instruction, and she began to speak in a deep voice. "Spirits of Lamplight Woods," she began. "I, Madame Hawthorne, the most powerful of psychics and the parter of the veil between worlds, call upon you." It was so ridiculous that I almost laughed. Someone else at the table wasn't able to help herself, however. I clearly heard a small but muffled giggle come from where Greta was sitting. She quickly choked it down as the woman continued. "I sense the presence of a spirit here tonight," she said. "Madame Hawthorne demands that you make your presence known. Knock upon this table 3 times. After a brief hesitation, there was a thumping noise that came from the center of the table. It was followed by a second, and then a third. One of the guests audibly gasped. It amazed me that anyone could be so gullible. Madame Hawthorne was obviously a fraud. I knew at the moment that I laid eyes on her, and I know it to this very day. She had no real power, unless you counted the ability to separate superstitious rich people from their money. I'm certain that she wasn't responsible for what came next. I've had a long time to think it through, and I think what allowed it to happen were the others that were gathered. With the exception of myself and dear sweet Greta, the young people around the table seemed to believe the woman had the ability to summon spirits. Belief can be a powerful thing, oftentimes more powerful than reality. Madame Hawthorne had just started speaking again when she abruptly stopped. She was silent for a long moment, so long that we all opened our eyes and stared at her. The candles that had been illuminating the courtyard were now extinguished, and I noticed that the already chilled air was a bit colder as it moved through the open area. We all released each other's hands and watched in silence as the supposed psychic simply stared off into the distance for what seemed like forever. Her eyes were unfocused, and her mouth was slightly open. I couldn't be sure, but I thought that I could see her lips moving as if she was whispering to herself. When she snapped out of her trance, she reached up to her hair and pulled a small needle out from within the locks. She held it out in front of her with the point up. "The spirits wish to speak with you all," she said with an odd tone in her voice. "However, the mystic forces are preventing them from doing so. They require a simple sacrifice from each of you to break through. A single drop of blood." We all exchanged glances. "A single drop of blood," Madame Hawthorne repeated. "A little prick with a needle on the tip of your finger is all that stands between you and the secrets of the afterlife. One unmissed droplet of red liquid in exchange for knowledge that the rest of humanity can only dream of. It's hardly any price at all, is it?" Without waiting for a response, she turned to the young man sitting to her right and presented him with the needle. After a brief moment's hesitation, he took it from her and held it up to see it better. With his friends mumbling their encouragement, he extended one finger and poked the end of the needle into the skin. A small drop of blood bubbled up from below the surface. Let it drop onto the table, Madame Hawthorne instructed. The boy did as he was told, turning his finger over and allowing the droplet to fall and splatter onto the table. The spot was barely visible between the dark wood and the dim courtyard. Having done as he was asked, he passed the needle along to the young woman sitting between him and me. She obviously didn't want to prick herself with it, and she momentarily refused until the other guest half convinced, half bullied her to do it. Her hands were shaking, and the needle ended up going in deeper than it needed to, but she got the job done before handing it to me. I had no intention of drawing my own blood. On the other hand, Greta was looking at me expectantly when I glanced over at her, and I didn't want to make things difficult for her in front of her friends. When I took a closer look at the needle, the answer presented itself. The young woman who had just taken her turn had pressed it so hard into her finger, there was a good amount of blood gathered on the point. Taking a deep breath while feigning a look of concern, I pretended to prick the end of my index finger before discreetly tapping the needle to make the blood already on it fall onto the table. Everyone seemed to have been fooled, so I passed the sharp object along to Greta. She gave me a quick smile before immediately pricking her finger and adding her blood to the table's growing collection and giving the needle to the young man on her right. When everyone had finished, Madame Hawthorne took the needle from the last of the wealthy teenagers and held it up in front of her. "Well done, children," she said with a broad grin. "The summoning ritual is complete. I have to say that I wasn't sure you were all going to be fucking stupid enough to prick yourselves with the needle that this fraud bitch you've known for 5 minutes gave you, but you proved to me once again that people like you are goddamn idiots. At least I didn't have to stay in this wretched flesh suit for too long." As we all stared at Madame Hawthorne in stunned silence, she opened her mouth and swallowed the needle. Her entire body went rigid, her eyes so wide that it seemed like they would come out of their sockets. And that's when the sound started. It's a sound that I've never been able to forget, no matter how hard I've tried. Believe me, I have tried. It was the same sound that a zipper makes as it moves along its track, but mixed with the noise meat makes as it tears away from the bone. Starting at the crown of the head, Madame Hawthorne's body began to split apart down the middle. Blood, organs, and all the other things that make up a person's body sprayed out in all directions, covering both the courtyard and those of us seated at the table. Something was emerging from the remains as the body tore itself apart. Madame Hawthorne's skeleton somehow stood up, shedding the flesh that had previously contained it. As it did so, black tendrils wrapped around it to form a sort of cloak, long and flowing and somehow alive. Eyes made of coal and flame filled the skull's sockets, and chunks of bloody ruined skin dripped from its jaws. In that moment, I felt like I was standing in the presence of death itself, and to this day, I don't think that I was that far off with that feeling. None of us moved as the nightmarish creature watched us with its burning eyes for a long moment. When it finally moved, it almost casually reached over to the boy seated closest to it. It took one bony hand and placed it onto his shoulder. The strange cloak slithered down the arm and pierced into the boy's skin. He screamed in pain and attempted to get out of his chair, but he couldn't move. I could see the movement of the cloak under his skin, rippling in waves as it tore through his insides. The boy stopped screaming as his face began to shrivel. I don't have a better word for it than that. It was like all the fluid was being drained out of it. By the time his head slumped down to his chest, his face looked dry, almost mummified. The spell was broken. We all jumped to our feet and ran in different directions. The courtyard had 4 entrances, and at least one of us went through each. I grabbed Greta's hand and we fled through the nearest door, finding ourselves in a long hallway with closed doors on each side. I had never been inside Blackwood Lodge before, but Greta knew her way around inside. She led me down a number of side passages until she reached a large wooden double door. Fumbling around in the folds of her dress for a pair of heartbeats, she produced a key and unlocked the doors, pulling me inside with her before closing them again behind us. Before the door could fully close, a hand reached in through the gap and stopped it. One of the girls from the seance forced her way inside. Greta closed the door all the way and locked it. For a long while we just stood in the dark room, trying to catch our breaths. I turned and looked around at our surroundings. We were in a large sitting area. Several rooms were connected to it, including multiple bedrooms and the largest bathroom that I had ever seen. I noticed a picture on a nearby table and took a closer look at it. It showed Greta and presumably her parents standing in front of a waterfall. It wasn't hard to guess that we were in her family's lodgings. There was a scream from somewhere far away. The three of us stared at the door, listening intently as silence returned. That silence lasted for quite some time. As we stood there, I listened to the sound of the clock on the wall ticking away the seconds. 1 minute stretched into 2, then into 10. It was approaching half an hour when I began to think that the creature was gone. As if on cue, a second scream pierced the quiet. This one was much closer. It was difficult to tell, but it seemed to be coming from the same hallway the rooms we were hiding in were located. We all looked at each other and, without a word, hurried to find hiding places. I'm not sure how Greta and I both ended up under the bed in the master bedroom. It wasn't through any sort of agreement or even acknowledgement as to what the other was doing. There weren't all that many places to hide, so it was likely just due to a lack of choices. Whatever happened, I found myself pressed as far into the bed as I could get, my arm around her as we both covered our mouths in an attempt to hide our breathing. From my position, I could just barely see the other girl getting into the closet. It was filled with coats that were so long they went down to the floor. She pushed her way past them and completely disappeared behind them. She reached out and quickly closed the slatted wooden door. I didn't hear the door to the hallway open out in the sitting room. I didn't need to. I knew the moment that the creature entered. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up, and I felt chills go through my body while I simultaneously started sweating. Above all, though, there was a pressure in my head that was like the beginnings of a bad migraine. My entire being was reacting to the mere presence of it. "Little pigs," the creature said in a raspy voice as it moved through the sitting room. Come out, wherever you are." The long cloak blocked out the small amount of light coming through the bedroom doorway as it entered the room. Without pausing, it turned directly towards the closet and stopped in front of it. It ran one bony finger across the wooden slats. "I smell you, little pig," the creature hissed. It gripped the closet door and easily ripped it off the hinges. The cloak poured into the closet eagerly, and the girl inside let out a shriek filled with fear and agony. It didn't last long before it was abruptly cut off. It was replaced by a sickening gurgle, and the girl's now shriveled body slumped forward through the coats and down to the ground. "One little pig gone," the creature wheezed with a noise I interpreted as a laugh. "And one more little pig cowering under the bed." The cloak moved under the bed like a dark tidal wave. Instead of wrapping around both of us, it buried itself inside of Greta and violently jerked her out into the open. She opened her mouth to scream, but it forced itself down her throat. Her head snapped back as her eyes bulged. What I remember most is her feet. That's strange, isn't it? Out of all the horrible things that the creature did to Greta, the image burned into my mind is her feet swinging gently back and forth as she was lifted off the floor. When the creature had finished feeding, it dropped her body onto the mattress. Her top half flopped lifelessly over the edge, and her drained face hung mere inches from me. I clapped my hands over my mouth, certain that I would be next. Without so much as a glance in my direction, the creature turned and went back out into the sitting room before disappearing from view. I don't know how long I laid there in the dark, my hands covering my mouth and my heart beating in my ears. I kept waiting for the inevitable, but it never came. I strained my ears to hear any sign that the unearthly tormentor was nearby. The only sounds were those of the lodge, shifting and settling. I might have laid there forever if I hadn't noticed a certain smell. At first it was faint, and I couldn't quite place it, but within minutes I identified it as the scent of smoke. It rapidly grew stronger and stronger until it forced me out of my hiding spot. Fully expecting to see the horrible creature, I hurried out of the bedroom and into the sitting room. I was alone. There was, however, a bright light coming from underneath the door that led out into the hallway. I was no genius, but it wasn't hard for me to put two and two together to figure out there was a fire burning nearby. Knowing that I couldn't go out into the hall, I instead went over to the windows on the far side of the sitting room and opened them. Luckily, I was on the first floor. I scrambled out the opening and ran towards the tree line. When I reached it, I stopped and turned around. The entire Blackwood lodge was burning. Flames were shooting high up in the air, and the heat coming from the building was incredible. There was no sign of the cloaked creature anywhere. I probably should have stayed nearby. Even in a small town like Lamplight Woods, it wouldn't take long for the sheriff and volunteer fire department to arrive, not when the building on fire was the golden goose that kept the town's economy going. After considering it for a few minutes, though, I went into the woods, and I didn't stop walking until I reached home. The way I figured it, poor kid from the strange town in the woods standing in front of a burning building that was home to rich kids that liked to pick on him, wasn't exactly the best optics. I don't think anyone knows for sure who or what started the fire. Everyone has their theory, of course, but as the only person present at the fateful seance that night to survive, my theory is pretty different from all the others. Still, it's just speculation, not fact, so it's best to keep it to myself. I keep a lot of things to myself. Not even my dearly departed Mona, God rest her soul, knows what happened on Halloween night in 1948. The big question has always been why the cloaked creature left me alive. I've got a theory on that too, and this one I'll share with you. My blood never ended up on that table we were all sitting around when it was brought into this world. I think I could smell the blood of the people that pricked their fingers and deposited their drop of the red stuff onto the wood. Maybe it was even drawn to them. I didn't prick my finger, though. I only pretended to. Maybe that meant it couldn't smell me, or that it simply didn't care about me the way that it did the others. Who can say for sure? What is for sure is that I don't have a lot of time left. My doctors say it's not possible, but I swear I can feel the cancer creeping through me. I highly doubt that I'm going to make it to my birthday next month, and if I do, there's no way I'll be in any shape to appreciate it. I don't ask for much here at the end. All I want is to lie here in bed with what's left of my family around me, and when my time comes, for it to be like drifting off into a dream. That's all that I want. That, and that whatever abomination we summoned that night so long ago isn't waiting for me on the other side.